get together on weekends and drink their homemade wine that they all made, and they all thought they had the best homemade wine. And they would get together and they would have jam sessions on somebody's back porch or side porch, and they would play Croatian songs, and they would play polka songs, they would play country western songs, and they would sing. And therefore, they passed their love of the music and culture down to their kids. With my grandfather being the oldest of 9, he played the guitar, he played the bass, he played tamburizza music. And all of his brothers and sisters also either played and or sang. And to hear all of them sing together, 5 and 6 part harmony, was just magnificent, because they were all great singers and good musicians. And they passed the culture on. So luckily, I spent my childhood with my grandparents. And my grandfather at the time still had a band, and he would play on the weekends at that time. And he would take me along when I was 4, 5, 6 years old to a lot of his gigs that he played with his musicians. And growing up, you know, you're laying in your grandparents' bed taking a nap, and my grandfather had his instruments hanging on the wall. He had his Martin guitar hanging on the wall, and he had a couple of his tamburizza instruments hanging on the wall. And there's nothing I wanted more than to pull them down and play them. You know, I wondered what they did, and I was just so curious about it. And he must have seen something in me that he didn't see in his own 3 kids, that I had a real interest in the music. And I could hardly wait to pull these instruments down and play them. So thank goodness that I came from a broken home, because I spent all those formative years with my grandfather, whom was a great musician, and he was really a leader of the family, and he put me on track to do what I do now. And at the time, he had a band called the Arcadians. But let's go back a little bit further. In his earlier times, he played a lot of country western music, and a lot of our neighbors did too. My Aunt Donna was Yodeling Donna. My grandfather's name is Lonesome Joe. Their neighbor, Mr. Kalkbrenner, he was Fiddlin' Si. And they had a little country western group called the Lone Star Rangers back in the 1930s. This is before the war. And he just loved western music. And I still have his Martin guitar, and it even has big scratches on the back of the guitar from the big belt buckles that they used to have to wear. But they just idolized like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and the singing cowboys of the time. They actually got to perform on radio on Saturday mornings at 6:30 in the morning. They would drive all the way to sometimes West Virginia to be on WWVA, and then they would also drive to Uniontown on WMBS to broadcast. Can you imagine that? Broadcasting at 6:30 in the morning on a Saturday morning for 15 minutes to 30 minutes. There's one man that's left living. He's 97 years old. I just played for a picnic for him last month. His name is Mike Malosky. He's originally from our neighborhood. And in World War II, he was a POW. Twice he was captured. Okay? And quite an amazing man. He tells great stories, but he remembers hearing the Lone Star Rangers on the radio on Saturdays, and he would talk about how there were only a couple of homes at the time in the 1930s that had radios, and everybody would run over to somebody's house at 6:30 in the morning to hear the Lone Star Rangers play. But then World War II happened, and my grandfather went to the U.S. Army. He was drafted, and he was there for 3 years, serving in Germany and Luxembourg. And when he came home from the service, I think pretty much there was a big explosion. There was a cultural explosion here in the United States. All the guys, you know, all the soldiers were coming back from World War II. Everybody was working. They were going to work. They were building homes. They were having families, and there was a cultural explosion too. And I'll explain this in a minute too, where you know, the first thing he did when he came home from the service was he went to buy some new tamburizza instruments, because he and his brothers wanted to start a band, which they did. They were called the Yadran Serenaders. It was my grandfather, my Uncle Frank, and a couple other fellows from the neighborhood. John Haas and I remember was in the group. Pete Bacon from Versailles, Ed Kirchwell from Versailles. And they would play 4 or 5 nights a week at the time. And imagine their first gig that they had, they were paid $25 for the whole band. So this was $5 a man. And my grandfather said that was pretty good. So as the 40s went on, the wages got bigger, like they were making $8 a man, then $10, then $15. And so he did the tamburizza thing for a good while, and he still did it through his life, but he really enjoyed the polka music. And when Frank Yankovic came out in 1948, that's when a lot of smaller groups started being formed all over the place. There were several in this area. And Frank Yankovic started a trend that he made. Let's go back to the Croatian culture, and I can talk about this because I know more about that. But when there were groups that would play at Croatian homes, okay, you would have immigrants that would come over, you know, wherever they settled, and they would go to the Croatian club because their common people were there. You know, just like the Serbian club, the Italian club, the Russian club. You would go, like, for example, if I moved to, I don't know, India, I would look for the American club because I would know I could speak to somebody and they know my culture. Well, same thing with them. They came over, and as a matter of fact, I just heard a story about the Rankin Croatian home, the three-level Rankin Croatian home, that they used the top level of the club to actually temporarily house immigrants so they could get up on their feet. Frank Valentich told me this recently, which I never think of the Rankin Croatian home or any Croatian home housing people, but they did that for certain immigrants till they got on their feet. At the time, American music was big bands. When you went to see a band somewhere, there were 12, 15-piece, 20-piece bands, Glenn Miller, you know, those bigger bands. And it was the same way with the Slavic cultures. If you went to the Croatian club in the 19-teens or 1920s, you didn't see a 3 or 4-piece band like we have today. You saw this big band, euphoniums, trumpets, clarinets, a piano, you know, guitars. They had larger groups. All these cultures did. The Slovenians did, the Croatians did. And I think a lot of our ethnic music kind of mirrored American music, believe it or not. American music trends, because back in the old days, it was very, very uncommon to see a 2 or 3 or 4-piece band play in a club or at a picnic. Maybe under the trees in your back porch, maybe, but not at a club performing. And Saturday nights, you went to the Croatian club. You know, you took your family, and they would have a lot of opera-style events. You know, classical music, classical Croatian music. They would play American music, but there was always a big group. Now, after the war, and everybody comes home, all of a sudden, those big groups got scaled down. And I like to think that Frank Yankovic was one of the first pioneers of that. You know, he has the phrase of America's Polka King. And he had a 5-piece group, which was very unheard of back then because all the groups were always very large. And as you see, American music kind of mirrored the same thing where groups, you know, Beatles, 4-piece, you know. If the Beatles were out in 1915, they probably would have 15 guys on the stage with trumpets and horns and everything. But all these bands started popping up in the area, and my grandfather was one of them. He had the Arcadians for 25 years, and he got with a guy named Walt Zemansky who lived in Glassport. He was a Glassport native, and he met him through a guy named John Capus. Johnny Capus was a graduate of McKeesport High School. He was a great piano player and an accordion player, kind of weird, you know, but because he was crazy about music. And they all started a band called the Starlighters in the 1950s, and they had a pretty nice run. Then what happened to my grandfather was he was working turns at the mill, and he would work 3 to 11. And then all of a sudden, when his band had to start playing at 9 or 10 o'clock, he couldn't make the gigs, at least the first hour or two, and he had his brother Frank go down and try to help him out and play bass for a while. But that only lasted for a short time. So my grandfather actually had to quit Walt Zemansky's group called the Starlighters after about a 7-year run. They used to play 6 nights a week back then, 6 nights a week. And the only night that they were off were Monday nights. And guess what they did on Monday night? They had rehearsal. The Zemansky name is very popular because they're all from Glassport. And his brother Richie had the Fifth Avenue Hotel, the Zemansky Inn. That's where they would practice on Monday nights. But they'd go out playing a couple nights a week. They played at Paulie's Lookout right across the river. And I heard all the stories about all those glory days. My grandfather hauled an upright bass. Never bought a car unless he could get an upright bass in it. I still do that to this day. When I bought my Chevy Traverse last year at the Chevy dealer on Route 48, I took a string bass with me. And I told Jared Candelor, if you could get this bass in this car, I'll buy this car. He did, so I bought the car. I still do that to this day. But, you know, I got to meet a lot of great local musicians through my grandfather, obviously. I used my grandfather. I made cue cards and notes because I didn't want to leave anybody's name out of my presentation today. But everybody was kind of, it's like a family tree. Like I thought about this guy here, but then he split off into two directions, and then I thought about this. But we'll start with Walter Z and the Starlighters. And I told you my grandfather knew this guy named John Capus. At the time, McKeesport had at least 3 accordion teachers that I know of. That they actually had accordion studios where they taught accordion in McKeesport. You had Chester McConey, who supposedly had his studio somewhere on Walnut Street, near where 30th Street comes down. And Chester McConey was there, he had an accordion studio. You had Izzo Kroll, who was also very popular. And you had, oh, thank you. Is there a vodka in this?
Yes, it's all vodka.
Oh, it's open too. Oh, thank you. You're too kind. Wow, thank you. You had Izzo Kroll. And then there was a fellow who lived in Chickieville. You know where Chickieville is? That's the neighborhood right across the street from International Village. And his name was John Yushko. He was a good teacher. And then there was the fellow who was originally from Braddock, who lived a long time in North Versailles, named Al Palmer. And we'll get back to him in a minute. But at the time, my grandfather had met this gentleman named Ivan Bacon. They grew up in a close neighborhood. And they were around the same age. And I'm going to guess that they met at the Versailles Croatian Club sometime when they were kids. And Ivan Bacon played the guitar, and he sang, and he loved Western music, and he went through life with his guitar. And he wasn't a great musician, but what he was a good talker. And he felt that any place that had a jukebox could have live entertainment. So he would go to every bar, every tavern, every club in McKeesport. If you had a jukebox, then he would push his band. So he started a band called the Melody Tunes. And when they started out, they were kind of rough. They had some trouble getting some guys together. So Ivan Bacon and my grandfather went to Chester McConey's accordion studio and says, hey, do you have any accordion students that are ready to go out and play? So they referred this John Capus, who was born and raised, I believe, down on Lincoln Street. And they started playing gigs. And then Capus was in school with a sax player at the McKeesport school named Milan Tatalovich. Milan Tal, they called him. Milan Tal knew Walter Z, Walt Zemansky from Glassport. So that's how they all got tied together. But they had their Melody Tunes group, and I remember they used to be able to play on WLOA in Braddock. Every once in a while they would play live. And Ivan Bacon, he made these great big patches to put on their coats that said, Ivan Bacon and the Melody Tunes, WLOA recording artist, And he always made himself sound bigger than he was. But he was a great promoter, great talker. And they spent their, childhood growing up years together. Ivan Bacon was quite a character. But then, that netted John Capus. He was a very big help to me because I would go to his house. He lived the last 30 years of his life up on Beckman Drive, right up here. And he had a piano and he had an accordion. He would show me a lot. And he would show me, I'd say, hey, I'm playing this way. And he would say, well, put your finger here and then do chord inversion this way. He was a great mentor to me, John Capus, very important in my life. But then my grandfather and Walt Zemansky and John Capus and Milan Tal, they were the original Starlighters. So if you're around in the 1950s, say around 54, 55 through 62, and if you saw the Starlighters play, that was my grandfather's band. Now, one of the proud things that my grandfather took from that band was they got to perform at Bill Mazeroski's wedding.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, yeah, I actually have a picture, an 8x10, of Walt Zemansky and the Starlighters, my grandfather there, with Bill Mazeroski, because he married a Polish girl from Glassport. Yeah. So they knew each other through the Starlighters. And supposedly Bill Mazeroski still remembers the band because there's different people that have asked him that. So that's one of the things. My grandfather coveted that photo. He kept that in the cedar chest. He really loved that. But like I said, he had to, quit playing for a while and because of his turns in the mill. And then all of a sudden, he got steady daylight. So he's itching to play again. So through the Ivan Bacon years, he knew a couple of local musicians. There was a drummer named Peter Goebbels, who was a local guy, and there was a saxophone player named Irvin Scharball. And they had an accordion player named John Wojtek, who he was all the way from Whitaker, from Munhall, you know. And they got together and they played the better part of the next 25 years. That's the group that I remember. That's the group that I grew up watching, and mentors to me. They were great mentors to me, the Arcadians. And my grandfather told me they would play 5 or 6 nights a week, and they never had to travel any farther than the Trafford Polish Club or St. Rita's Church in Munhall. Okay, that's how much they played in this area. Now, I'm driving to Indiana, to Cleveland, to Youngstown, to St. Mary's, to Uniontown. Last night I was past Seven Springs, so he never did that. He never had to do that back in his day. He was here in the McKeesport and surrounding area with all these musicians. The Arcadians, the group that I grew up watching, they started out, they played polkas, and they played ethnic tunes, and they played a lot of czardashes too, which were Hungarian and Slovak folk dances. But they also played all the current pop tunes of the day from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But they started off every one of their gigs that they played, every time they played, with this polka.